Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy doors of a Victorian workhouse where the desperate, the destitute, and the unlucky found themselves when fortune turned its back. This is a place where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was treated like a moral failing that needed correction through hard work, thin soup, and the crushing weight of shame. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy drifting off to history that's both fascinating and sleep-inducing. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you think you could have survived a week in the workhouse. I read them all, mostly because these stories deserve to be remembered. Now, dim those lights, maybe adjust your pillow, and get comfortable. The Victorians would probably insist you sleep on a straw mattress with a scratchy blanket, but you've earned better than that. Picture this. It's 1845, and you're standing outside a massive brick building that looks more like a prison than a refuge. The windows are small and barred, the walls are high, and the smell, well, let's just say hundreds of people living in close quarters with minimal bathing facilities creates an atmosphere you can taste. This is your new home, whether you like it or not. You've lost your job. Maybe the factory closed, maybe you got sick, maybe your husband died and left you with 3 children and no income. Whatever the reason, you've ended up here, at the Union Workhouse, the Victorian solution to poverty, that managed to be both a lifeline and a punishment at the same time. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 reshaped how Britain dealt with its poor. The old system of outdoor relief, giving money or food to people in their homes, was deemed too expensive and too encouraging of idleness. The new workhouses would offer food and shelter, but only under conditions so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would accept them. It was called less eligibility. Life in the workhouse had to be worse than the life of the poorest independent laborer. As you approach the entrance, a porter eyes you suspiciously. You're not the first to arrive today, and you won't be the last. The economic panic of the 1840s has filled these institutions beyond capacity. People queue at the gates like customers at a shop, except what they're buying is survival at the cost of their dignity. You state your name, your age, your trade if you have one. The porter writes it down in a ledger with ink that smells like rust and regret. He asks about your family, your circumstances, whether you've been here before. Each question feels like an accusation. Why aren't you working? Why can't you provide for yourself? Why should the parish support you? The master of the workhouse appears, a stern man with mutton chop whiskers and a waistcoat that suggests he's never missed a meal. He explains the rules in a voice that's heard this speech 1,000 times. You'll work for your keep, you'll follow orders, you'll be separated from your family. Men in one ward, women in another, children somewhere else entirely. If you break the rules, you'll be punished. If you try to leave before serving your time, you'll be arrested for absconding. You nod because what choice do you have? The alternative is sleeping in a doorway and starving in the gutter. The admission process begins. First, you're taken to a bathroom, though that's a generous term for a room with a cold water tap and a tin bath that's seen too many bodies and not enough cleaning. You're required to bathe, to scrub away the dirt of the streets, to wash your hair with carbolic soap that stings your scalp and leaves you smelling like a hospital. Your clothes are taken away, every personal possession cataloged and stored. The dress you've worn for 3 years, the shawl your mother gave you, the boots with holes in the soles, all of it goes into a labeled box that you won't see again until you leave, if you leave. In exchange, you receive the workhouse uniform. For women, it's a shapeless dress made of coarse blue and white cotton, an apron that's been worn by who knows how many others, and a cap that makes everyone look the same. For men, it's gray trousers, a rough shirt, and a jacket that might have fit someone once but certainly doesn't fit you. The uniform is more than clothing. It's a badge of failure. Anyone who sees you on the streets will immediately know what you are: a pauper. Someone who couldn't make it in the world, someone who had to beg for parish charity. You're assigned a number. In some workhouses, you're not allowed to use your name. You're just number 47 or number 153, as if poverty has stripped away your identity along with everything else. Then comes the medical inspection. A doctor who may or may not have any real qualifications looks you over, checking for infectious diseases, vermin, signs of moral degeneracy. He asks intrusive questions about your health, your habits, your history. Each answer goes into another ledger, another permanent record of your inadequacy. If you're sick, you might be sent to the infirmary ward, which sounds better than it is, as we'll discover later. If you're pregnant, there's a lying-in ward, where babies are born to the sound of other women's labor and the knowledge that your child will grow up in this same institution. Finally, you're taken to your sleeping quarters. The women's ward is a long room lined with iron bedsteads, each with a thin straw mattress, a rough blanket, and a sheet that's been washed so many times it's nearly transparent. The beds are arranged in rows like soldiers, each one exactly 3 feet from the next, just close enough that you can hear your neighbors breathing, coughing, crying in the night. There's a small wooden box beside each bed for your few possessions, a comb perhaps, or a prayer book if you're lucky enough to have one. The windows are high and small, letting in just enough light to see by, but not enough to make the room feel less like a prison cell.
One woman introduces herself, quietly, because talking after lights out is against the rules. She's been here since her husband died 2 years ago. She works in the laundry, standing in steam and hot water for 12 hours a day, her hands permanently red and raw. She tells you the tricks, how to make your bread ration last longer, which matrons to avoid, where you can steal a few minutes of rest during work hours. Another woman says nothing at all, just stares at the ceiling with eyes that have seen too much. You'll learn later that she's been here for 5 years, that her children were taken away and sent to different workhouses, that she's given up hope of ever seeing them again. A bell rings, harsh and loud, echoing off the brick walls. That's the signal for lights out. Everyone climbs into their narrow beds, pulling the thin blankets up to their chins. The room is cold. The workhouse guardians believe that a warm room encourages laziness, and you can see your breath in the dim light. You lie there, listening to the symphony of the workhouse at night. Someone is coughing, a wet rattling sound that speaks of consumption or bronchitis. Someone else is crying, trying to muffle the sound in their pillow. A baby wails in a distant ward, the sound carrying through the thin walls. You think about how you got here, the series of small disasters that led to this moment. The job you lost, the rent you couldn't pay, the landlord who put your belongings on the street, the friends who couldn't help because they were struggling too, the family members who turned away because they had their own problems, the slow slide from working poor to desperate poor to here. Tomorrow, you'll wake before dawn to the sound of that same harsh bell. You'll work all day at whatever task they assign you, breaking stones, picking oakum, scrubbing floors, working in the laundry. You'll eat meals that barely qualify as food. You'll follow rules designed to break your spirit as thoroughly as the work breaks your body. But tonight, in this moment between arrival and what comes next, you're just tired. Bone tired, soul tired, tired in ways you didn't know were possible. And somehow, despite the hard mattress and the cold room and the sounds of suffering all around you, you sleep. Because in the Victorian workhouse, sleep is the only escape that doesn't require permission, the only mercy that comes without conditions, the only time when you can forget, just for a few hours, where you are and why you're here. The bell rings at 5:30 in the morning, though in winter it's still pitch dark outside. No snooze button exists in the Victorian workhouse. No gentle wake up, no time to ease into consciousness. The matron walks through the ward with her keys jangling, shouting at anyone who dares to pull the blanket over their head for one more moment of warmth. You stumble out of bed, your body aching from yesterday's work and the thin mattress that offered more lumps than support. The room is freezing. Frost patterns decorate the inside of the windows, and your breath comes out in visible puffs. There's no heat until breakfast, and breakfast is still an hour away. The morning routine is rigidly timed. You have 10 minutes to visit the privies, outdoor toilets that are little more than holes in the ground, shared by dozens of women, offering no privacy and less dignity. There's a perpetual queue, and if you don't move fast enough, you'll miss your turn and have to hold it until the midday break. Then it's to the washroom, where cold water flows from a single tap into a stone trough. You splash your face, trying to wake up, the icy water shocking your system. There's one rough towel for every 10 women, already damp from earlier risers. Soap is rationed, one small bar per week, expected to last for bathing, washing clothes, and anything else you might need it for. You return to your bed to make it according to workhouse standards. The blanket must be folded precisely, corners squared like a military inspection. The mattress must be shaken to redistribute the straw. The floor around your bed must be swept clean. The matron inspects each bed, and if yours doesn't meet her standards, you'll redo it until it does, missing breakfast in the process. At 6:30, another bell rings for morning prayers. The entire workhouse gathers in the chapel, or tries to, given that most workhouses were built to house fewer people than actually live in them. You stand shoulder to shoulder with the other inmates, that's what they call you here, as if poverty were a crime, listening to the chaplain drone on about sin and redemption and being grateful for the charity extended to the undeserving poor. The sermon always hits the same notes. You're here because of your own failures. The workhouse is an act of Christian mercy that you don't really deserve. Hard work will redeem your character. Idleness is the devil's workshop. If you were more industrious, more moral, more careful, you wouldn't be here. You're supposed to feel chastised, humbled, motivated to improve yourself. Mostly you feel hungry and tired and wonder how long the chaplain will talk. The answer is usually 30 minutes minimum, sometimes up to an hour if he's particularly inspired. Finally, breakfast. You file into the dining hall, another large room with long wooden tables and benches, worn smooth by countless bottoms. The walls are painted institutional green, and the windows are too high to see out of. Every sound echoes. The scrape of benches, the clatter of bowls, the murmur of voices quickly hushed by the matron's glare. You take your assigned seat, always the same one, always surrounded by the same people. The master says grace, a long, elaborate prayer that thanks God for this bounty and asks him to make you worthy of it. Your stomach growls loudly enough that your neighbor hears it and suppresses a smile.
The food arrives. Breakfast is gruel, always gruel. It's made from oatmeal and water, occasionally with a tiny bit of milk if the workhouse guardians are feeling generous. No salt, no sugar, no butter. Just a gray, lumpy porridge that has the consistency of wallpaper paste and roughly the same flavor. Your portion is measured exactly. 6 ounces of oatmeal, made into however much gruel that produces, served with 6 ounces of bread. The bread is coarse and brown, made from the cheapest flour, sometimes mixed with ground beans or peas to stretch it further. It's hard enough to use as a weapon, and there are stories of men who've done exactly that. You eat slowly, trying to make it last, trying to convince your stomach that this is adequate nourishment. Around you, others do the same. The room is nearly silent except for the sound of spoons scraping bowls and the occasional cough. Some people have their own strategies for surviving workhouse food. They save pieces of bread for later, hiding them in their pockets despite the rules against it. They trade portions, someone who can't stomach gruel swapping with someone who wants more. They close their eyes and imagine they're eating something else, a roast dinner, a meat pie, their mother's stew. The meal lasts exactly 15 minutes. When the bell rings, you're expected to finish immediately, regardless of whether you're done. The bowls are collected, the tables wiped down, and it's time for work. Work assignments are posted on a board in the hallway. You scan the list, looking for your number, hoping for something relatively bearable.
The work varies by workhouse and by season, but none of it is easy. For women, the most common task is oakum-picking. You're taken to the oakum shed, a large room with high windows that let in the light, but not warmth. You're given a handful of old rope, tarred rope from ships, hard and stiff and reeking of pitch. Your job is to untwist it, to pull apart the fibers, to pick out every strand until you have a pile of loose hemp. Your fingers will bleed. The tar coats your hands, getting under your nails, in every crack of your skin. The fibers are sharp and stiff, and they cut your fingers as you work. By the end of the first hour, your hands are raw. By the end of the day, they're covered in small wounds that will sting when you wash them and throb as you try to sleep. You're required to pick a certain amount of oakum per day, usually around 2 pounds. If you don't meet your quota, you don't get supper. If you consistently fail to meet it, you might be sent to the refractory ward, where the punishment is harder work and even less food. The work is mind-numbing. You sit on a hard wooden bench, picking at rope hour after hour. You can't talk. Talking during work is forbidden. You can't sing. You can't do anything but pick and pick and pick until your hands move automatically and your mind goes somewhere else. Some women develop strategies to cope. They count the strands they've picked, turning it into a game. They compose stories in their heads, creating elaborate fantasies about lives they might have lived. They pray, running through every prayer they know and then making up new ones. They think about nothing at all, entering a kind of trance state where time passes without awareness. Other work assignments aren't much better. The laundry is hot, steamy, and exhausting. You stand over tubs of boiling water, scrubbing sheets and clothes with lye soap that burns your skin. The smell is overwhelming. Hot, wet fabric, lye, the collective odors of hundreds of people's dirty laundry. By the end of a shift, you're soaked with sweat and water, your arms aching, your back screaming. Stone breaking is reserved for men, but women sometimes do it too if the workhouse is short on male labor. You sit in the yard with a pile of stones and a hammer, breaking large stones into small ones that can be used for road repair. The hammer is heavy, the stones are hard, and every impact jars your arms and shoulders. In summer, the sun beats down mercilessly. In winter, your fingers go numb with cold. Cleaning is considered easier work, but that's relative. You scrub floors on your hands and knees with hard brushes and cold water. You polish brass and shine windows. You clean the privies, shoveling out the waste pits, a job so disgusting that it's usually reserved as punishment. The workhouse kitchen offers some advantages. It's warm, and there's occasionally the possibility of stealing extra food. But the work is intense, preparing meals for hundreds of people with minimal ingredients and maximum scrutiny. You peel mountains of potatoes, chop endless turnips, stir huge cauldrons of gruel that bubble and spit like volcanic mud. Some women work in the nursery, caring for workhouse children. This is considered desirable work because at least you're around something innocent, something that isn't your own misery. But it comes with its own heartbreak. Caring for other people's children while yours are in a different ward, watching them suffer from inadequate food and medical care, seeing them sicken and sometimes die. At noon, another bell rings for dinner, the main meal of the day, though calling it main is generous. You file back to the dining hall, take your assigned seat, and wait while the food is served. Dinner varies by day of the week. Sunday might be meat, a few ounces of cooked beef or mutton along with potatoes and bread. Monday through Saturday, it's a rotating menu of vegetables, soup, suet pudding, or bread and cheese. The portions are calculated to the ounce. For men, it's typically 8 ounces of meat on Sunday, 14 ounces of bread and cheese on other days, along with varying amounts of potatoes or other vegetables. Women get slightly less, the theory being that they do less work and therefore need less food. Children get the least of all. The soup is memorable for all the wrong reasons. It's made from bones boiled for so long they've given up every last molecule of nutrition, with some vegetables thrown in for appearance. It's thin, watery, and tastes like the ghost of food rather than actual sustenance.
The suet pudding is a Victorian specialty, a boiled dough made with suet, beef fat, and flour, sometimes with a few raisins if you're lucky. It's heavy, it's filling, and it sits in your stomach like a cannonball. But at least it has calories, which matter when you're doing physical labor on minimal rations. After dinner, there's a brief break. 30 minutes if you're lucky, sometimes less. You can visit the privy again, maybe walk in the yard if the weather permits. Some women use this time to check on their children, catching glimpses through windows or during the brief moments when the wards overlap. Then it's back to work until 6 in the evening. More oakum, more laundry, more stone breaking, more endless, grinding labor that serves no purpose except to prove you're not idle, to demonstrate that you're earning your keep, to reinforce the lesson that poverty is something you must atone for through suffering. The afternoon is when exhaustion really sets in. Your hands hurt, your back aches, your stomach is never quite full enough. The minutes crawl by. You count them sometimes. 360 minutes until supper. 359, 358. Time moves differently when you're doing work you hate in a place you don't want to be. At 6, the bell rings for supper. Back to the dining hall, back to the same seat, back to another measured portion of food. Supper is usually bread and gruel, sometimes with a small piece of cheese or a bit of butter if the guardians are feeling generous. The portions are smaller than dinner, just enough to keep you from starving, not enough to satisfy. After supper, there's an hour of leisure time, though it's hard to call it leisure when you're exhausted and cold and sore. You might go to the day room, where you can sit on hard benches and do nothing in particular. Talking is allowed during this hour, though conversations are carefully monitored by the matrons who patrol the room. Some women use this time to mend their clothing or help each other with small tasks. Some write letters, if they're literate and can afford paper and postage, trying to maintain contact with families or friends on the outside. Some just sit, staring at nothing, too tired to move. Religious services are held most evenings. Another opportunity for the chaplain to remind you of your failures and God's mercy. Attendance is technically voluntary, but not attending is noticed and noted and might affect your treatment. At 8 o'clock, the final bell rings for bed. You return to your ward, prepare for sleep, which means putting on a rough cotton nightgown that provides minimal warmth, and climb back into your narrow bed. The matron makes her rounds, checking that everyone is in their assigned bed, that the lights are out, that no one is talking or causing trouble. Then she locks the ward door from the outside, and you're sealed in for the night. This is when the day's accumulation hits you. Your body aches in new and creative ways. Your hands throb from the oakum or the laundry. Your back complains about the hours of bending. Your stomach growls, never quite satisfied by the workhouse rations. But you're too tired to care much. Sleep comes fast and deep, the sleep of physical exhaustion, dreamless and absolute, until the bell rings again at 5:30 and the whole routine starts over. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the same bells, the same gruel, the same work, the same rules. Time blurs into a monotonous rhythm where the only markers are the slightly different meals on different days and the slow progression of seasons visible through high windows. This is the daily life of the Victorian Workhouse, a carefully calibrated system designed to be just barely tolerable, to keep people alive, while making sure they never forget that they failed at the basic task of supporting themselves. It's not quite prison, not quite charity, but something uniquely Victorian in its blend of help and punishment, mercy and cruelty, survival and suffering.
Let's talk about workhouse food in detail, because food, or the lack thereof, defined so much of workhouse life. The Poor Law Commissioners set dietary standards that workhouses were supposed to follow, and these standards tell you everything you need to know about Victorian attitudes toward poverty. The official diet was calculated to provide just enough nutrition to keep inmates alive and working, but not enough to make the workhouse comfortable. It was designed to be monotonous, plain, and deliberately unappetizing. The theory was that if workhouse food was too good, people would choose to live there rather than work in the outside world. For adult men, the weekly ration typically included 137 ounces of bread, roughly 8.5 pounds, 12 ounces of cheese, 21 ounces of cooked meat, on Sundays only, various amounts of potatoes, oatmeal, and soup, 7 pints of gruel, 14 pints of milk for the gruel. Women received about 20% less, based on the assumption that they needed fewer calories. Children's rations scaled down from adult portions based on age, with the youngest children receiving the least. On paper, this sounds almost adequate. In practice, it was a masterclass in institutional starvation.
Let's start with the bread. Workhouse bread was made from the cheapest flour available, often mixed with ground beans, peas, or even sawdust to stretch it further. It was baked in huge batches in the workhouse kitchen, often coming out undercooked in the middle and burnt on the edges. The loaves were massive, sometimes 8 pounds each, and hard enough to use as doorstops. The texture was somewhere between wood and cardboard. Chewing it required determination and good teeth, neither of which workhouse inmates necessarily had. It was dry, coarse, and had a flavor that can best be described as brown. Not the warm, nutty brown of good whole-grain bread, but a flat, slightly bitter brown that tasted of disappointment and cheap ingredients. But bread was calories, and calories mattered. Inmates hoarded bread crusts, hiding them in pockets or mattress straw. They softened stale bread in their gruel to make it edible. They traded bread with inmates who couldn't stomach the gruel, creating an informal economy where bread was currency. The gruel deserves its own paragraph, possibly its own novel. Victorian workhouse gruel was a punishment masquerading as nutrition. It started with oatmeal, the cheapest grade available, sometimes mixed with ground beans, peas, or even sawdust to stretch it further. It was baked in huge batches in the workhouse kitchen, often coming out undercooked in the middle and burnt on the edges. The result was a gray, lumpy porridge with the consistency of wallpaper paste. It was served lukewarm, which was somehow worse than if it had been hot or cold. Hot gruel at least had the virtue of being warm. Cold gruel could be gagged down quickly. Lukewarm gruel just sat there in your bowl, congealing, while you tried to convince yourself to eat it. It tasted of exactly nothing, if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, it tasted of whatever contaminated the oatmeal: weevils, dirt, the mysterious ingredients added to stretch it further. Sometimes you found things in your gruel: a bit of straw, a piece of string, objects that made you question the entire supply chain. But gruel was filling. It sat heavy in your stomach, creating the illusion of satiation even if it didn't provide much actual nutrition. On a cold morning, it was warm. When you were desperately hungry, it was food. These low bars of expectation defined workhouse survival. The meat ration sounds generous: 21 ounces on Sunday. That's more than a pound of meat. Except that this was weighed before cooking, and the meat in question was the cheapest cuts from the cheapest animals: elderly sheep that had stopped producing wool, dairy cows that could no longer give milk, occasionally horses that had dropped dead in the street. The meat was boiled, always boiled, never roasted or grilled. Boiling was economical, easy to do in large quantities, and destroyed any flavor the meat might have possessed. The resulting product was gray, stringy, and tough. You chewed and chewed and chewed, and sometimes you gave up and just swallowed chunks whole. The cooking water became soup, served at other meals during the week. This soup was the definition of optimistic naming. It was hot water that once had meat in it, seasoned with nothing, containing a few random vegetables that were mostly potato. Potatoes appeared frequently in workhouse meals. They were cheap, filling, and could be stored for long periods. But workhouse potatoes had usually been stored too long. They were sprouting, soft, sometimes rotting. They were boiled until they disintegrated into a watery mash with the texture of library paste. The cheese ration might sound like a luxury, 12 ounces of cheese per week, except workhouse cheese was made from skim milk, all the good stuff removed for butter or sale, resulting in a hard, dry product that was more protein brick than actual cheese. It was often moldy by the time it was served, but you ate around the mold because wasting food could result in punishment. Suet pudding was the workhouse's attempt at variety. Suet is beef fat, and when mixed with flour and water and boiled in a cloth, it creates a solid, heavy, dense mass that fills your stomach completely. Sometimes raisins or other dried fruit were added, making it almost palatable. More often, it was just dough and fat, a flavorless bomb of calories. The official diet was supplemented, or was supposed to be, with vegetables. Turnips featured heavily. Cabbage appeared with depressing regularity. Carrots, if you were lucky. These vegetables were always boiled, always overcooked, always served without seasoning or butter or anything that might make them appetizing. What the official diet didn't include was telling. No sugar, no tea, no fresh fruit, no milk except what went into gruel, no butter, no eggs, no fish, nothing with any flavor or luxury or joy. Inmates developed strategies to survive on these rations. The most important was eating everything you were given, no matter how unappetizing. Food was survival, and you couldn't afford to be picky. You ate the moldy cheese, the gristly meat, the weevil-containing gruel, because refusing meant going hungry, and hunger in the workhouse was dangerous. Trading was common, despite being forbidden. Someone who could tolerate gruel but hated cheese might trade with someone who had opposite preferences. Those doing hard physical labor might trade their bread for someone else's cheese to get more protein. The elderly, who often couldn't chew the hard bread, might trade it for softer food.
Some workhouses allowed inmates to buy extra food from the workhouse kitchen if they had any money. A small portion of butter, a bit of sugar, tea leaves for making your own cup of tea. But most inmates had no money, and the prices were deliberately set high enough to keep this privilege rare. The inadequacy of the diet showed in the inmates' bodies. Everyone was too thin, with hollow cheeks and visible bones. Scurvy appeared from lack of fresh vegetables and fruit. Beriberi showed up from the limited diet. Anemia was common. Children failed to grow properly. Pregnant women struggled to carry healthy babies to term. The workhouse masters and guardians, meanwhile, ate differently. They had their own dining rooms with their own food: roasts, pastries, butter, jam, fresh vegetables, wine. The chaplain and the doctor joined them for these meals. The contrast was stark and intentional. Those who had succeeded in life versus those who had failed, marked by what they ate. Meal times themselves were orchestrated as exercises in control and humiliation. Everyone ate at precisely the same time, in the same place, in complete silence. You couldn't ask for more food. You couldn't refuse food without punishment. You couldn't eat faster or slower than the time allowed. Every bite was monitored, regulated, controlled. Some workhouses implemented the silent system. Inmates were forbidden from speaking at any time, including during meals. You ate in complete silence except for the sound of spoons on bowls, chewing, swallowing. No conversation, no communion, just the mechanical consumption of inadequate nutrition. The portions were measured with mathematical precision.
Kitchen staff used scales and measuring cups to ensure that everyone got exactly their allotted amount, not an ounce more. This wasn't generosity, it was economy. Food cost money, and the guardians were answerable to taxpayers who resented every penny spent on paupers. Children's meals deserve special mention for their inadequacy. Growing children received less food than adults despite needing more nutrition. A child's breakfast might be half a slice of bread and a small bowl of gruel. Dinner might be a few ounces of potato and a tablespoon of meat. Supper was bread and more gruel. The result was predictable. Workhouse children were universally malnourished. They were smaller and weaker than their peers outside the workhouse. They were more susceptible to disease. Their bones didn't develop properly. Their teeth rotted from lack of nutrition. Many died before reaching adulthood, their graves marked with simple stones in workhouse graveyards. The old received slightly better rations in some workhouses, a bit more meat, sometimes butter or tea. This was partly pragmatic. The elderly did less work and needed incentives to stay compliant. But even these improved rations weren't enough. Malnutrition among the elderly was common, contributing to the high death rates in workhouse infirmaries. The sick received sick diet, supposedly better food to help them recover. In theory, this meant white bread instead of brown, beef tea, milk, perhaps an egg. In practice, sick diet was often as inadequate as regular diet, just slightly different. And getting prescribed sick diet required convincing the workhouse doctor that you were genuinely ill, not faking sickness to get better food. Food became an obsession. Inmates talked about it constantly during the brief periods when talking was allowed. They reminisced about meals they'd eaten before entering the workhouse. They fantasized about foods they might eat if they ever got out. They dreamed about it at night, elaborate banquets that dissolved into gruel when they woke. The psychological impact of this food-focused misery was profound. Food represented everything you'd lost: home, family, dignity, choice. The inability to feed yourself adequately, to choose what to eat, to satisfy your hunger. These were constant reminders of your dependent, diminished status. Holidays brought slight improvements that made regular meals seem even worse by contrast. Christmas dinner might include plum pudding, actual pudding with fruit and spices and a bit of brandy, possibly some roast beef instead of boiled mutton, an extra slice of bread. These small luxuries made the return to normal rations even more depressing. The annual cost of feeding a workhouse inmate was calculated down to the shilling. In the 1840s, it cost roughly 4 to 6 pounds per year to feed one person, about 8 to 12 shillings per week. The guardians were proud of this efficiency, boasting in their reports about how economically they were managing the poor. But consider what that meant. 8 shillings per week divided by 21 meals equals roughly 4 pence per meal. That's what Victorian society decided a human being deserved to eat. 4 pence worth of the cheapest, nastiest food available. Some progressive reformers argued for better workhouse diets. They pointed out that hungry people couldn't work effectively, that malnutrition led to disease, and that the cost of sick diet exceeded what would be saved by feeding people adequately in the first place. Their arguments fell on deaf ears. The workhouse wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be a deterrent. The greatest cruelty of workhouse food was its adequacy for survival, but inadequacy for living. It kept you alive, but never satisfied. It prevented immediate starvation, but caused long-term malnutrition. It was calculated to keep you working, but never thriving. A perfect metaphor for the Victorian attitude toward the poor. The children's ward is where the workhouse's cruelty became almost unbearable. Children didn't choose poverty. They were born into it or thrown into it by circumstances beyond their control. Yet they suffered the same conditions as adults, with less food, less understanding, and less hope of escape.
Children entered the workhouse in several ways. Some were born there, their first breath drawn in the lying-in ward, their first sounds mixing with the groans of laboring mothers and the cries of other newborns. Some came with their families when poverty struck. Some were orphans, sent by parishes that couldn't or wouldn't care for them. Some were illegitimate, their mothers unable to support them alone. The moment they arrived, children were separated from their parents. Boys over 7 went to the boys' ward, girls went to the girls' ward. Mothers might see their children for an hour on Sunday if the master allowed it, might catch glimpses through windows, might hear their cries echoing through the building. But they couldn't comfort them, couldn't tuck them in at night, couldn't protect them from the harsh regime of workhouse life. The children's day started at the same ungodly hour as adults. 5:30 in the morning, a bell clanging in the dark, small bodies stumbling out of narrow beds. The dormitory was crowded, beds jammed close together, sometimes 2 or 3 children to a bed if space was short. Older children help younger ones dress in their workhouse uniforms, pants and shirts for boys, dresses and aprons for girls, all made from the same coarse material, all in dull colors. Shoes if they were lucky, bare feet if not. Hair combed roughly, faces washed in cold water, then lined up for inspection. Breakfast was even more inadequate for children than adults. A small bowl of gruel, a piece of bread. Growing bodies got less food than full-grown adults, based on the logic that they were smaller and therefore needed less. The reality was they were growing and needed more, but Victorian arithmetic didn't account for that. After breakfast, school, one of the few mercies of workhouse childhood. The 1834 Poor Law required workhouses to provide basic education. This meant a schoolroom, usually cold and crowded, with a schoolmaster or schoolmistress who might or might not have any teaching qualifications. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic. Religious instruction took up much of the day: Bible verses to memorize, prayers to recite, moral lessons about sin and redemption and being grateful for charity. Practical lessons, too. Girls learned sewing and domestic work. Boys learned manual trades. The teaching methods were harsh. A child who couldn't remember their alphabet might be struck with a ruler. A child who daydreamed during lessons might be made to stand in the corner for hours. A child who talked back could be sent to bed without supper. Education was a privilege, and privileges could be revoked. Some workhouse schools achieved surprising success. A good teacher could make a difference, could give children tools to escape poverty. But many teachers were there because they couldn't find better work, were burned out or cruel, saw their students as future criminals and servants rather than children with potential. After school came work. Even young children were expected to contribute. 6-year-olds picked oakum, their small fingers better suited to the delicate work than adult hands. 7-year-olds worked in the laundry, in the kitchen, scrubbing floors. 10-year-olds did nearly adult work for no pay beyond their food and shelter. The work was exhausting for small bodies. A child's hands bled from oakum just like an adult's. A child's back ached from hours of scrubbing, but complaints were met with punishment, not sympathy. Idleness was sin, and even children needed to atone for the sin of being poor. Mealtimes were especially sad in the children's wards. Small faces hunched over bowls of gruel, trying to make inadequate portions fill endless hunger. Some children cried from hunger. Others had learned not to cry, knowing it did no good. They just ate what they were given and tried not to think about being hungry all the time. The portion sizes were calculated with the same precision as adult rations, just smaller. A 5-year-old might get 4 ounces of bread daily. A 10-year-old might get 6 ounces. Never enough. Always measured, always monitored to ensure no child got more than their allotted share. Playtime was strictly controlled, An hour in the yard, weather permitting, under the watchful eyes of matrons who made sure play didn't get too rowdy. No running, no shouting, no games that might lead to accidents or trouble. Children stood in groups, talking quietly if they were allowed to talk at all, or just stood there, too tired or too cowed to play. Some workhouses provided minimal toys, a few wooden blocks, some balls, perhaps a doll or two. These were communal property, carefully controlled, more often displayed than played with. The message was clear. Even play was a privilege that could be revoked. The relationships between children were complicated. Siblings were separated by gender, might rarely see each other. Friendships formed but were fragile. Children came and went as families entered and left the workhouse. Trust was difficult when everyone was hungry and desperate. Bullying was common. Older children picked on younger ones, taking their food, their few possessions, asserting dominance in an environment where they had no other power. The staff rarely intervened unless it got too obvious. A certain amount of rough treatment was considered character building. Disease hit children hardest. Crowded dormitories, poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, the perfect conditions for illness to spread. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, tuberculosis. Once one child got sick, it swept through the ward like fire. The sick were isolated in the infirmary if there was room. If not, they stayed in their beds while healthier children tried to stay away. Treatment was minimal. Bed rest, perhaps some beef tea if the doctor prescribed it, prayer. Many recovered through sheer resilience. Many didn't.
The workhouse graveyard was disproportionately filled with small stones marking children's graves. Died aged 3, died aged 7, died aged 10. Sometimes just infant, babies born in the workhouse and buried from it, their lives beginning and ending in the same grim institution. Infants and toddlers had their own ward, the nursery. This might sound pleasant, but workhouse nurseries were overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. A single nurse might care for 20 or 30 babies and small children. Feeding, changing, comforting so many children was impossible. Babies cried, all the time. Hungry, uncomfortable, sick, lonely, they cried, and there weren't enough hands to comfort them, so they lay in their cribs, crying themselves hoarse, eventually giving up and lying silent, which was somehow worse. Infant mortality in workhouses was staggeringly high, sometimes over 50%. Babies died from malnutrition, from disease, from lack of care, from their mother's inability to properly nurse them on workhouse rations. Their deaths were noted in registers with clinical detachment. Died of marasmus, wasting away. Died of convulsions. Died of debility. Orphans made up a significant portion of workhouse children. Some were true orphans, both parents dead. Others were functionally orphaned, parents who had abandoned them, parents who couldn't cope, parents who were themselves in other institutions. These children had no one on the outside, no visitors, no hope of leaving until they aged out. For orphans, the workhouse was their entire world. They knew no other life. Some adapted, becoming model inmates, obedient and silent and small. Others rebelled, acting out, getting punished, developing the hard shell they'd need to survive in a world that clearly didn't want them. At age 8 or 9, the workhouse started preparing children for their futures. For girls, this meant intensive domestic training. They learned to cook, clean, sew, do laundry, all the skills needed to become servants. The best students might be placed in respectable households as maids. Most would drift from one low-paid domestic position to another. For boys, it meant apprenticeships. At age 12 or 13, boys could be apprenticed to tradesmen, farmers, factory owners, ship captains.
In theory, this gave them a skill and a future. In practice, workhouse boys were often treated as cheap labor, worked hard, fed little, taught minimal skills. Some masters took pauper apprentices specifically because they could abuse them without consequence. Who would listen to a workhouse boy complaining about mistreatment? Some apprentices ran away, returning to the workhouse or trying to survive on the streets. Some endured until their apprenticeship ended and they were free. Some died in service, their deaths noted with the same bureaucratic indifference as everything else. Girls sometimes became domestic servants in the workhouse itself, graduating from inmate to employee. This was considered a success. They had steady work, food, shelter. That it was the same grim institution didn't seem to matter to the authorities. At least they were earning their keep. The emotional toll on workhouse children is almost impossible to calculate. Many grew up without knowing affection, without experiencing the security of family, without ever feeling safe or valued. They learned that the world was harsh, that no one cared about them, that survival meant shutting down emotions and following rules. Some maintained hope. They told each other stories about what they'd do when they left, the lives they'd build, the families they'd have. They dreamed of being different from their parents, of escaping poverty, of never ever sending their own children to such a place. Others gave up. You could see it in their eyes, a deadness, an acceptance that this was their life and always would be. These children moved mechanically through their days, eating without appetite, working without interest, sleeping without rest. The lucky ones had an adult who cared, a kind teacher, a sympathetic nurse, even an older child who took them under their wing. These relationships were lifelines, proof that someone in this harsh place saw them as individuals worth caring about. Letters from the outside were treasured beyond measure. A letter from a sibling who'd left the workhouse, from a parent who'd managed to get work and was trying to bring the family back together, from anyone who remembered you existed outside these walls. These letters were read and reread until they fell apart, every word memorized, every sentence a promise of something better. Some progressive reformers tried to improve conditions for workhouse children. They argued for better food, more education, less separation from families. They wrote reports, gave speeches, lobbied Parliament. Some reforms happened. The Boarding Out Act of 1885 allowed children to be placed with foster families instead of kept in workhouses. The Education Act of 1870 began providing free education outside the workhouse. But change was slow, and for children in the workhouse in the 1840s and 1850s, these reforms came too late. They lived through the harshest period, when the system was at its most punitive, when the doctrine of less eligibility was strictly enforced, when childhood was seen as no excuse for dependency. The children's ward at night was haunted by small sounds, crying quietly because loud crying brought punishment, coughing, the wet sound of sick lungs, whispering between children brave enough to talk after lights out, the rustle of straw mattresses as small bodies tried to find comfortable positions, and sometimes singing, quiet singing, a child remembering a lullaby their mother once sung and sharing it with the darkness and anyone who could hear. It was an act of resistance, a refusal to let the workhouse take everything, a small assertion that they were still children despite everything. If you listen carefully on a quiet night in those long demolished buildings, maybe you can still hear it. The ghost of children's voices singing themselves to sleep, holding on to humanity in the least human of places. Surviving another day in the Victorian workhouse.
The workhouse infirmary was where you went when you were too sick to work, and where many people went to die. Victorian medical care was primitive by modern standards, and workhouse medical care was primitive even by Victorian standards. The combination of overcrowding, poor nutrition, and inadequate treatment made disease a constant presence. Every workhouse was required to employ a medical officer, a doctor who would visit regularly, treat the sick, and advise on health matters. These positions were poorly paid, often part-time, and attracted doctors who couldn't establish successful private practices. Some were competent and caring. Many were not. The workhouse doctor might visit once or twice a week, spending an hour or two examining patients and prescribing treatments. For a workhouse housing several hundred people, this was grossly inadequate. Patients who became sick between visits had to wait, growing sicker, while nurses, often untrained inmates themselves, did their best with limited supplies. The infirmary was typically just another ward, sometimes in a separate building if the workhouse was large enough. Rows of iron beds, thin mattresses, minimal heating. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, chamber pots, the particular odor of disease, carbolic acid attempting to mask it all. Patients lay in beds too close together, disease jumping easily from person to person. A patient with tuberculosis might be in the next bed to someone recovering from surgery. Someone with typhoid might be near someone with pneumonia. Infection control didn't exist as a concept. Germs wouldn't be accepted as disease carriers until later in the century. The nursing staff consisted of pauper inmates with no medical training, supervised by a matron who might have slightly more experience. These nurses did their best, but they were often elderly themselves, or sick or weak. They couldn't provide the care patients needed because they didn't know how and didn't have the resources. Medical supplies were minimal. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Medicines were the cheapest available: laudanum for pain, calomel, mercury, for almost everything else, castor oil for digestive issues. More advanced treatments were unavailable or too expensive. Surgery was performed on site for minor issues, setting broken bones, lancing abscesses, removing rotten teeth. Anesthesia was rare. Chloroform was available by the 1850s, but considered an extravagance for paupers. You bit on a leather strap and endured. For serious surgical cases, patients might be transferred to a regular hospital if one existed nearby and would accept workhouse inmates. Many hospitals refused pauper patients, considering them undeserving of charity beds, so serious injuries or illnesses often meant death because treatment wasn't available. Common diseases in the workhouse included tuberculosis, called consumption, was endemic. The combination of crowded conditions, poor nutrition, and bad ventilation created perfect conditions for TB to spread. The characteristic cough echoed through the wards, wet, rattling, productive of blood. Treatment was fresh air, rest, and better food, none of which the workhouse could adequately provide. Most TB patients eventually died, their bodies wasted away to skeletal frames. Typhoid and typhus, both called fever, swept through workhouses regularly. They spread through contaminated water and lice. Patients burned with fever, became delirious, developed the characteristic rash. Treatment was supportive: cold compresses, fluids, prayer. Mortality was high, 20 to 30% of cases. Cholera was the dreaded epidemic disease. When cholera hit a workhouse, it could kill dozens in days. The severe diarrhea and vomiting dehydrated patients so quickly that they died within hours of symptom onset. The disease spread through contaminated water, though this wasn't understood until John Snow's work in 1854. Workhouse wells and water supplies were often contaminated by nearby cesspits, creating perfect conditions for cholera to flourish. Influenza struck every winter, killing the weak and elderly. What would be a mild illness for a healthy person became life-threatening for malnourished workhouse inmates with no reserves to fight infection. Skin diseases were ubiquitous. Scabies, lice, bedbugs, fleas, parasites infested everyone. Rashes, sores, infections from scratching.
The workhouse doctor spent much of his time treating these chronic conditions that never quite went away because the conditions causing them never changed. Malnutrition diseases appeared regularly: scurvy from lack of fresh vegetables and fruit, rickets in children from lack of sunlight and proper nutrition, beriberi from the limited diet. These were entirely preventable with better food, but better food cost money. Respiratory diseases, bronchitis, pneumonia, asthma were common. The cold, damp buildings, poor ventilation, and general ill health made lungs vulnerable. Winter was especially deadly, the mortality rate spiking as cold weather weakened already fragile bodies. Mental illness was poorly understood and worse treated. Depression, anxiety, what we'd now call PTSD, these were common in people who'd lost everything and lived in constant stress. The treatment was prayer, hard work, and being told to pull yourself together. Severe mental illness might result in transfer to the county asylum, which was its own kind of horror. Childbirth in the workhouse was dangerous for both mother and baby. Women giving birth received minimal care, a midwife if they were lucky, another inmate with experience if not. Pain relief was rarely available. Complications often proved fatal because there was no way to intervene effectively. Puerperal fever, infection after childbirth, killed many new mothers. The lack of hand washing and sterilization meant that birth attendants carried infection from patient to patient. A woman might survive delivery only to die days later from raging infection.
Babies born in the workhouse faced terrible odds. Premature infants had virtually no chance of survival. Even healthy full-term babies struggled when their mothers couldn't produce enough milk on inadequate rations. Infant formula didn't exist. The only alternative to breast milk was pap, bread soaked in water, or thin gruel, neither adequate nutrition for a baby. The elderly filled many infirmary beds, people too old or sick to work, waiting to die. They suffered from the ailments of age, heart disease, cancer, stroke, dementia. Palliative care meant a bed and minimal pain relief. Many elderly inmates specifically entered the workhouse to die, having nowhere else to go. Accidents were common. Stone breaking led to crushed fingers and toes. The laundry caused scalding burns. Working with machinery in workhouse shops resulted in amputations and crushing injuries. Treatment was basic. Set the bone, bandage the wound, hope for the best. Chronic pain was universal and untreated. People with arthritis, old injuries, the lingering effects of disease, they worked anyway, because everyone worked. Pain was not an excuse. Laudanum was available but rationed because addiction was a concern, so people suffered. The doctor's visits followed a routine. He'd walk through the infirmary, examining patients who'd been brought to his attention. A quick look, a few questions, a notation in his book. Diagnoses were often guesses. Treatments were limited to what was available. Prescription, beef tea and brandy, appeared frequently in medical records. The Victorian cure-all for anything that couldn't be fixed with mercury or castor oil. But actually getting the prescribed beef tea or brandy required the master's approval, and masters were notoriously reluctant to authorize expensive treatments. Some doctors genuinely cared. They fought with the guardians for better supplies, better conditions, more resources. They visited more often than required, stayed longer, tried to make a difference. These men were heroes in a quiet way, practicing medicine under impossible conditions for patients who couldn't pay and a system that didn't value their work. Other doctors saw workhouse appointments as easy money. Visit twice a week, prescribe whatever was cheapest, collect your salary. The patients were paupers. Who cared if they died? The guardians certainly didn't object to a doctor who never requested expensive treatments. Death was so common it became routine. Multiple deaths per week in large workhouses, more during winter or epidemics. Bodies were washed by inmates, wrapped in shrouds, placed in plain coffins. Funerals were minimal, a service in the workhouse chapel, burial in the workhouse section of the local cemetery, a simple stone with name and date if they were lucky. The dead were buried cheaply. Common graves held multiple bodies, coffins stacked like cordwood. Markers were wooden and temporary, rotting away within years.
Many graves went unmarked entirely, just a mound of earth that settled over time, erasing even the memory of the person below. Family members rarely attended these funerals. They might not know their relative had died until weeks later. They might be in other workhouses themselves. Or they might simply not come. The shame of workhouse death, too much to face. The workhouse graveyard tells the story of 19th century poverty better than any document. Row after row of graves, many marked simply pauper. Infants and children heavily represented. Dates showing death came in clusters when disease swept through. The sheer number of graves, thousands in larger workhouses, demonstrating how many people died dependent on parish charity. Some progressive reformers targeted workhouse medical care for improvement. Florence Nightingale's work during the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, raised awareness of the importance of trained nursing and proper hospital conditions. Her subsequent work reforming civilian hospitals included attention to workhouse infirmaries. The Metropolitan Poor Act of 1867 began separating sick care from poor relief in London, creating separate infirmary facilities for the sick poor. But this reform came late and didn't extend to rural areas for many years. Most workhouse inmates continued receiving inadequate care in inadequate facilities. Medical innovations of the Victorian era, antisepsis, anesthesia, germ theory, reached workhouses slowly, if at all. These advances benefited paying patients first. Paupers got the leftovers: outdated treatments, disproven theories, the dregs of medical progress. The psychological impact of the infirmary was profound. To end up there meant that you couldn't work, which meant that you'd lost even the minimal value the workhouse assigned you. You became a pure expense, a drain on resources, someone waiting to die rather than contributing to the institution. Patients lay in their narrow beds, listening to others cough, moan, cry out in pain or delirium. They waited for the doctor's brief visits, hoping for something to ease their suffering. They watched other patients die and wondered if they'd be next. They remembered when they were healthy, when they had homes and families, when their bodies worked and life held possibility. Some recovered and returned to the work wards, grateful to be well enough to pick oakum or break stones again. Some became chronic invalids, permanently in the infirmary, their slow decline playing out over months or years. Some died quickly, disease or injury taking them before anyone could do much about it. The medical staff, as such it was, did what they could. They bathed patients, changed bedding, administered medicines, held hands. They offered comfort when they couldn't offer cure. In a system designed to be harsh and deterrent, these small mercies mattered. But the fundamental problem remained. The workhouse was a terrible place to be sick. The conditions that made it a deterrent to the able-bodied made it deadly to the ill. Poor food, cold buildings, overcrowding, stress. Everything that made the workhouse unpleasant made recovery from illness unlikely.
The sick deserved comfort, rest, proper nutrition, skilled care. They got hard mattresses, inadequate rations, untrained nurses, and occasional visits from underpaid doctors. They got prayer, lots of prayer, as if God would fix what medicine and proper care could not. As you lie in your narrow bed tonight, comfortable and warm and well-fed, spare a thought for those who lay in workhouse infirmaries, who suffered without adequate relief, who died surrounded by strangers rather than family, who were buried in common graves and forgotten by history. Their suffering was real, their deaths mattered, and the fact that society created institutions where the sick poor died in such numbers should haunt us as much as any ghost story. Let's talk about the people who ran these institutions, the masters, matrons, and guardians who held power over the lives of workhouse inmates. These were the faces of authority in a system designed to be harsh, and they interpreted their roles in ways ranging from compassionate to outright cruel. The workhouse master was the king of his domain. He lived on site, usually in comfortable quarters attached to the workhouse with his family, if he had one. His wife typically served as matron, managing the women's wards and domestic arrangements. Together, they wielded enormous power over hundreds of lives. The position required no specific qualifications. Some masters were former military men used to discipline and authority. Some were failed businessmen who needed steady employment. Some were opportunists who saw an easy living in a position that provided housing, meals, and a salary for relatively light work. The pay was modest but steady, perhaps 60 to 100 pounds per year, plus room and board, which was attractive in uncertain economic times. A good master could make the workhouse bearable. He might interpret rules flexibly, showing mercy where regulations allowed. He might fight with the guardians for better food or supplies. He might treat inmates as human beings rather than problems to be managed. These masters were rare but existed, men who saw their position as a responsibility rather than just a job. More common were masters who enforced every rule rigidly, who saw inmates as morally deficient and treated them accordingly. These men believed that poverty resulted from laziness or sin, and that harsh treatment was both deserved punishment and necessary correction. They ran their workhouses like prisons, maintaining order through fear and punishment. The worst masters were outright abusers. They embezzled food and supplies, selling them for personal profit while inmates starved. They used their positions to exploit vulnerable people sexually, emotionally, and financially. They inflicted punishments far beyond what regulations allowed. These men turned the workhouse into their personal fiefdoms, answerable to no one as long as they kept costs low and trouble quiet. The Board of Guardians, local officials elected to oversee the workhouse, were supposed to provide oversight. They met weekly or monthly to review accounts, hear complaints, set policy. But many guardians were businessmen or landowners with limited time and interest. They approved budgets, reviewed mortality statistics, and generally deferred to the master's judgment on day-to-day operations. Some guardian boards were diligent, visiting regularly, inspecting conditions, questioning expenses. Others rubber-stamped whatever the master proposed, concerned only that costs remained low and no scandals reached the newspapers. The quality of governance varied wildly from one union to another. The matron, usually the master's wife, controlled the women's wards with similar authority. She assigned work, distributed rations, enforced discipline, decided which rules could be bent and which could not. A kind matron might slip extra food to a pregnant woman or allow a mother more time with her child. A cruel one might withhold medical care or impose harsh punishments for trivial infractions. Matrons often had help from assistant matrons or senior inmates who'd earned positions of relative trust. These assistants enforced rules, supervised work, reported infractions. Some used their small authority compassionately, others became petty tyrants, bullying those beneath them in the hierarchy, enjoying the power after years of powerlessness. The schoolmaster and schoolmistress taught the workhouse children their letters and moral lessons. Some were dedicated educators who saw potential in pauper children and worked to give them tools for better lives. Others were time servers who did the minimum required, seeing their students as future criminals and prostitutes rather than children worth teaching. The chaplain held special authority as spiritual guide and moral arbiter. He led prayers, gave sermons, visited the sick, buried the dead. His sermons invariably emphasized sin, punishment, redemption through suffering, and gratitude for the charity extended to the undeserving poor. A compassionate chaplain might offer genuine comfort to the suffering. More often, chaplains reinforced the ideology that poverty was moral failure. The medical officer's role we've discussed, usually part-time, underpaid, responsible for hundreds of patients with minimal resources. His relationship with the master was crucial. A doctor who requested expensive treatments or criticized conditions faced conflict with a master trying to keep costs low. Most doctors learned to work within constraints, prescribing only what they knew would be approved. The porter controlled the gate, who entered, who left, who brought messages or deliveries. He kept the register of admissions, noted comings and goings, enforced visiting restrictions. A sympathetic porter might pass messages between inmates and the outside world, might look the other way when rules bent slightly.
A harsh one made every interaction with the outside world as difficult as possible.
Lower-level staff, cooks, storekeepers, supervisors of various work wards, each had their spheres of influence. The cook controlled food distribution, could slip extras to favorites or withhold from those who displeased her. The storekeeper managed supplies, could be bribed, or might be scrupulously honest. Every staff member, from top to bottom, had power over inmates' lives in small or large ways. Staff relationships with inmates varied enormously. Some staff were kind, recognizing their good fortune in being on the better side of the workhouse divide. They treated inmates with humanity, remembered their names, acknowledged their dignity. These staff made workhouse life slightly more bearable through small acts of mercy. Other staff were cruel, seeing inmates as lesser beings who deserved their fate. They enforced rules rigidly, punished harshly, took satisfaction in exercising power over the powerless. These staff made workhouse life actively miserable, adding gratuitous humiliation to necessary hardship. Many staff fell somewhere in between, neither particularly kind nor cruel, just doing their jobs, seeing inmates as problems to manage rather than people to care about. They enforced rules because those were the rules, assigned punishments according to the book, kept the system running without much thought to the human cost. The master's family, if he had one, lived in the workhouse too. His children grew up surrounded by poverty and suffering, seeing their father treated with deference by people who had nothing, living comfortably while others starved. Some children developed empathy, understanding their privilege and treating inmates kindly. Others learned entitlement, seeing nothing wrong with the vast disparity between their lives and those of the people their father governed. Corruption was common. Masters and matrons found numerous ways to profit from their positions. Food ordered for inmates could be sold elsewhere, with cheaper substitutes served. Supplies could be embezzled. Inmates' labor could be hired out, with the master pocketing the payments. Relatives might be given lucrative contracts to supply the workhouse with goods or services at inflated prices. Sexual exploitation occurred in workhouses run by unscrupulous masters. Young women had no protection if the master or his sons or male staff chose to abuse them. Complaints went nowhere. Who would believe a pauper over a respectable official? Pregnancy from such assaults resulted in the woman being punished for moral failure, while her abuser faced no consequences. Physical abuse was sometimes systematic. Masters who believed in breaking spirits through breaking bodies might use punishment regimes that went beyond legal limits. Starvation cells, prolonged isolation, beatings, these occurred in the worst-run workhouses, hidden from guardians and inspectors behind walls of silence maintained by fear. Even in better-run workhouses, the power imbalance created problems. Masters made arbitrary decisions affecting inmates' lives. Who got the worst jobs? Who received sick diet? Who was punished for infractions? There was no appeal, no recourse, no way for inmates to challenge decisions except through formal complaints to guardians, which rarely succeeded. The guardians themselves were often conflicted. They were responsible for both caring for the poor and keeping costs low for taxpayers. These goals contradicted each other. Better care cost more money, economy meant worse conditions. Most chose economy, believing that harsh conditions deterred idleness and that the deserving poor would somehow still be adequately cared for. Some guardians were ideologically committed to harshness. They believed deeply that poverty resulted from moral failure and making the workhouse comfortable would encourage dependency. They fought against any improvements, any softening of rules, any expense that wasn't absolutely necessary. These men spoke of discipline and self-reliance while condemning people to misery. Other guardians were genuinely concerned, but constrained by budgets and politics. They might want better conditions, but couldn't justify higher poor rates to taxpayers. They might see suffering but feel powerless to change a system that seemed unchangeable. These men made small improvements where possible, but couldn't transform the fundamental nature of the institution. The relationship between national policy and local implementation created wide variations. The Poor Law Commission set general rules, but local boards had significant discretion in how they applied them.
One workhouse might allow married couples to sit together on Sundays. Another kept them separated except for church. One might provide decent food within budgetary limits. Another would cut every corner to minimize costs. Public opinion influenced workhouse management. Scandals in newspapers could force changes, a master fired, a matron dismissed, conditions investigated. But scandals had to be truly egregious to attract attention. Regular, everyday cruelty went unreported and unaddressed, because that was just how workhouses operated. The best masters saw themselves as reformers working within a flawed system. They couldn't change the poor law, but they could interpret it humanely. They fought for their inmates with guardians, stretched rules where possible, tried to make a bad situation slightly less bad. These men and women often burned out, ground down by the system they were trying to improve. The worst masters became monsters, corrupted by unchecked power over vulnerable people. They created kingdoms of cruelty where their word was law and inmates lived in terror. When these men were finally exposed and removed, the conditions they'd created shocked even Victorian sensibilities hardened to workhouse suffering. Most masters were ordinary men, doing an unpleasant job for modest pay. They enforced harsh rules because those were the rules. They kept costs low because that was their mandate. They maintained order because disorder was unacceptable. They weren't heroes or villains, but bureaucrats administering a system designed to be punitive, and they administered it with varying degrees of humanity.
The staff's quarters told their own story. While inmates slept on straw mattresses in crowded wards, the master and matron had comfortable beds in private rooms. While inmates ate gruel, staff dined on roast meat and vegetables. While inmates shivered in unheated buildings, staff enjoyed coal fires. The contrast was stark and intentional, a daily reminder of success versus failure, independence versus dependency. Some staff felt guilty about this disparity. They saw the suffering around them and felt uncomfortable with their relative comfort. These staff might be kinder as compensation, or they might leave for other work rather than continuing in a position that troubled their conscience. Others felt no guilt at all. They'd earned their positions, they were performing necessary work, and the poor deserved their lot through their own failures. These staff enjoyed their privileges without qualms, seeing nothing wrong with the vast inequality between their lives and those of the people they governed. The chaplain's role was particularly important in shaping the moral and psychological atmosphere. A fire and brimstone preacher who emphasized sin and punishment made the workhouse feel like an earthly preview of hell. A more compassionate chaplain, who spoke of redemption and hope, might make suffering slightly more bearable by giving it meaning. Most chaplains were conventional clergymen who saw workhouse appointment as duty, necessary but unpleasant work serving the lowest members of society. They delivered standard sermons, performed required services, and tried not to think too much about the suffering around them. They comforted themselves that spiritual care was their responsibility. Physical conditions were beyond their purview. The doctor's position was perhaps the most morally complex. He saw suffering he couldn't adequately treat because resources were lacking. He knew inmates were malnourished, but couldn't prescribe better food without the master's approval. He watched people die from preventable conditions because the system valued economy over life. Some doctors fought this, making noise, demanding better. Most accommodated themselves to limitations and did what little they could within them. Staff turnover varied. Some masters stayed for decades, becoming fixtures in their communities. Others lasted months before moving on to better positions or being fired for incompetence or corruption. High turnover created chaos as inmates adapted to new regimes with different rules and expectations. Long-serving staff sometimes became institutionalized themselves, unable to imagine working elsewhere, their identities bound up in their positions. They became as trapped by the workhouse as the inmates they governed, trapped by salary and housing and routine, by familiarity with a terrible place that at least was their terrible place. The children of workhouse officials grew up in a strange environment, privileged islands in seas of misery. They played in private gardens while workhouse children watched from windows. They ate good food while workhouse children starved. Some felt guilty and vowed to help the poor when grown. Others absorbed their parents' attitudes, learning to see poverty as deserved and the poor as lesser. Workhouse administration was detailed and bureaucratic. Registers recorded every admission and discharge, every birth and death, every punishment, every expense. Masters spent hours on paperwork, accounting for every penny and every person. This bureaucracy created a paper trail that historians now use to understand workhouse life, but it also reduced human suffering to statistics in ledgers. The guardians' meetings were formal affairs. Masters presented reports, budgets were reviewed, policies debated. Minutes recorded decisions in dry bureaucratic language that drained emotion from human tragedies. Resolved that Sarah Jones be transferred to the lunatic asylum documented a woman's descent into madness without mentioning her humanity or suffering. Some guardians never visited their workhouse except for formal meetings. They made decisions about people they'd never met, approved or denied resources for people they'd never seen. Other guardians visited regularly, inspected wards, talked to inmates, tried to understand conditions firsthand before making decisions. The relationship between workhouses and the broader community was complicated. Workhouses were shameful necessities. Everyone knew they existed, no one wanted to think about them. Respectable people avoided them, crossed the street rather than pass too close, treated inmates they encountered with visible disdain. This social isolation affected staff, too. Being associated with the workhouse carried its own stigma. The master might be invited to some social functions, but not others. His children might face exclusion or bullying. Staff lived in a liminal space between respectable society and outcast poverty. Some masters used their positions as stepping stones to better things, gaining administrative experience, making contacts, eventually moving to better positions in poor law administration or other bureaucracies. Others remained in workhouse service for careers, moving from smaller to larger unions, rising through the ranks, but never escaping the world of poverty management. The master's authority extended beyond the workhouse walls. He had power to grant or deny outdoor relief to people not yet in the workhouse. He could help someone avoid admission through small grants of money or food, or he could refuse, forcing them into the workhouse. This power made him both feared and courted by the poor. The most successful masters, from the system's perspective, ran orderly workhouses at minimal cost, with few complaints reaching the newspapers. They kept inmates working and compliant, maintained financial discipline, avoided scandals. These men were praised and promoted, held up as models, regardless of the human cost of their efficiency. The least successful masters either ran up costs, allowed disorder, or created scandals that embarrassed guardians and attracted unwanted attention. These men were dismissed,
Sometimes prosecuted, occasionally used as scapegoats for systemic problems that went far beyond any individual's failings. In the end, workhouse masters and staff were products of their system. A harsh system attracted and created harsh administrators. Kind individuals worked within cruel structures, their kindness limited by regulations and budgets, and the fundamental nature of an institution designed to be a deterrent rather than refuge. As we move through the workhouse at night, we see the master's lighted windows, comfortable rooms where he and his family live in relative plenty, while hundreds sleep hungry a few hundred feet away. The contrast captures the essential inequality of Victorian society. Some prospered, while others suffered, and the prosperity and suffering were interconnected, two sides of the same coin. The Victorian workhouse was built on discipline. Every aspect of life was regulated, and breaking rules resulted in punishment. The variety and severity of punishments reveal how the system maintained control over people who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. The most common punishment was reduction of diet, cutting rations for inmates who broke rules. This was particularly cruel given that normal rations were already inadequate. A day or two on bread and water, or having meat withheld, or receiving smaller portions could mean genuine hunger on top of chronic hunger. Dietary punishment was carefully regulated. The master couldn't simply starve people to death. There were limits to how much rations could be reduced and for how long. But within those limits, food became a tool of control. The threat of hunger kept inmates compliant.
Solitary confinement was another standard punishment. Inmates who fought, stole, refused to work, or broke other serious rules might be locked in a cell alone for hours or days. These cells were small, dark, cold, little more than closets with a stone floor and no furniture. Hours in solitary confinement passed slowly. No work to occupy hands, no conversation, no light, nothing but your own thoughts and the cold and the dark. For people already isolated from family and community, this additional isolation was psychologically devastating. The refractory ward was reserved for habitual rule breakers and troublemakers. This was a separate section of the workhouse with harsher conditions, harder work, less food, stricter supervision. Inmates sent to the refractory ward might spend months there, their punishment extended each time they committed another infraction. Hard labor was both normal work and special punishment. As punishment, it meant the worst jobs done under the strictest supervision. Breaking stones in the yard from dawn to dusk. The treadmill, if the workhouse had one. Walking on a rotating cylinder for hours, producing nothing but exhaustion. Oakum-picking with quotas doubled or tripled. The treadmill deserves special mention. This was a large cylinder with steps like a water wheel turned sideways. Inmates climbed the steps continuously. If you stopped, you fell. The treadmill might power a mill or pump water, or it might do nothing but serve as punishment. Hours on the treadmill left legs trembling and muscles screaming. Physical punishment existed, though regulations technically limited it. Corporal punishment of adults was illegal, but that didn't always stop it. A master with a temper might strike an inmate. Male supervisors might use violence to enforce compliance. These actions were against the rules but happened anyway, especially in workhouses where oversight was minimal. Children could be legally beaten. The schoolmaster had a cane and used it liberally for poor lessons, talking in class, fidgeting, or any behavior deemed inappropriate. The pain was immediate, the humiliation lasting. Children learned quickly to obey absolutely or face painful consequences. Public humiliation served as punishment and deterrent. An inmate who stole food might be made to stand in the dining hall during meals, holding a sign describing their crime, while others ate. An inmate who refused to work might be marched through the wards as an example. These public shamings added psychological torture to physical punishment. Loss of privileges was effective because inmates had so few privileges to lose. The privilege of receiving visitors might be revoked. The Sunday afternoon rest period might be canceled. The tiny bit of tobacco some workhouses provided could be withheld. Every small comfort could be stripped away as punishment. Inmates who committed crimes, theft, assault, property damage, could be prosecuted in regular courts. Workhouse masters had the authority to involve police, and they used it. A conviction meant prison time in addition to workhouse punishment, and prison in Victorian England was its own special hell. The punishment book recorded every infraction and consequence. These ledgers documented the petty tyrannies of workhouse life. Mary Smith, insolence to matron, 24 hours solitary. John Brown, refusing to work, diet reduced for 3 days. Sarah Wilson, talking after lights out, lost Sunday privileges. Humanity reduced to violations and penalties. Having their hair cut short as punishment for lice or poor hygiene, or sometimes just to humiliate them. Being denied contact with their children for days or weeks. The threat of punishment was perhaps more effective than punishment itself. Inmates lived in constant fear of breaking rules, knowing that every action was watched, every word could be reported, every minor infraction could result in consequences. This atmosphere of surveillance and potential punishment kept most people compliant most of the time. Classification of inmates created its own punishment system. The workhouse divided people into categories: able-bodied men, able-bodied women, children, elderly, infirm. But there were subcategories too: deserving versus undeserving, respectful versus refractory. Your classification determined your treatment, your work assignments, your prospects. Being classified as undeserving or refractory meant harder work, stricter supervision, reduced privileges, constant suspicion. It was a label that stuck, following you from workhouse to workhouse if you moved, marking you as troublesome in ways that affected every interaction with staff. Some inmates earned positions of relative privilege: assistant to the schoolmaster, helper in the kitchen, ward supervisor. These positions came with better treatment and could be revoked as punishment. An inmate who'd risen to a position of trust and then lost it through misbehavior experienced the fall acutely. Elderly inmates feared punishment especially because they had no resilience to endure it. Reduced rations meant genuine risk of starvation for someone already malnourished. Solitary confinement in a cold cell could trigger fatal illness. Even minor punishments, extra work, lost privileges, hit harder when you were already at your physical limit. Children were punished for being children, playing too loudly, laughing during work, daydreaming during lessons. Normal childhood behaviors became infractions requiring correction. The goal was to break them of natural inclinations and train them to be docile, compliant, useful. Many children succeeded in this training, becoming quiet and obedient. Others became expert at secret rebellion. The arbitrariness of punishment was perhaps worst of all. Rules were enforced inconsistently depending on the master's mood, the staff member in charge, the inmate's history and classification. What earned punishment one day might be overlooked the next. What one master treated as minor, another treated as serious. This unpredictability kept everyone anxious and uncertain. Appeals against punishment rarely succeeded. An inmate could petition the Board of Guardians, but guardians almost always supported their master's decisions. To rule against the master would undermine his authority and invite more challenges. So unless punishment was truly egregious and well documented, appeals were denied. Some inmates accepted punishment stoically. They'd broken a rule, they took the consequences, they moved on. Others sieged with resentment, feeling punishments were unfair or disproportionate. But resentment couldn't be safely expressed. Showing anger toward authority invited more punishment. The cumulative effect of the punishment system was psychological as much as physical. Inmates learned they had no control, no autonomy, no power over their own lives. Every action could be punished, every word monitored, every thought suspected. This learned helplessness made people easier to manage, but destroyed their spirit. Some inmates became expert rule followers, navigating the system by absolute compliance. They never talked back, never refused work, never broke even minor rules. They became invisible, unremarkable, safe through perfect obedience. This survival strategy worked, but at the cost of selfhood. Others became habitual rule breakers, punished so often that punishment lost its sting. These refractory inmates were seen as incorrigible, morally deficient, proof that harsh treatment was necessary. But often they were just people who refused to be broken, who maintained their humanity through rebellion, even when rebellion brought suffering. Staff had guidelines for punishment, but significant discretion in application. A kind matron might give warnings instead of punishments. A harsh supervisor might punish severely for trivial infractions. The system's cruelty was personal as well as institutional, embodied in individual choices about how to use power. The most insidious punishment was the denial of hope. Inmates who caused trouble might be told they'd never get out, that no one would employ someone with their record, that they'd die in the workhouse. These psychological attacks were impossible to document or appeal, but could be as damaging as any physical punishment. Religious punishment existed too. Extra prayer services, memorizing additional Bible verses, copying moral texts as penance. The chaplain could assign spiritual punishments that took time and energy while reinforcing messages about sin and unworthiness. Weather affected punishment severity. Solitary confinement in summer was uncomfortable. In winter, it could be deadly. Hours or days in an unheated cell with inadequate clothing. Masters could technically punish people to death without explicitly intending to kill them. Documentation of punishment was meticulous but sanitized. The punishment book recorded infractions and consequences, but not the human experience. 3 days bread and water didn't capture the physical weakness, the hunger pains, the psychological impact of being further deprived in an already deprived environment. Some historians have argued that workhouse punishment was necessary to maintain order in difficult circumstances. Others see it as systematic abuse of vulnerable people. The truth probably varies by workhouse and by individual case, but the overall pattern is clear. Punishment was frequent, often harsh, sometimes cruel, and served primarily to maintain control rather than rehabilitate or reform. The lasting impact on people who experienced workhouse punishment is impossible to fully measure. Some carried physical scars, damaged hands from extra oakum-picking, weakened bodies from dietary punishment.
Most carried psychological scars, trauma from humiliation, learned behaviors of submission, difficulty trusting authority even after leaving. As the night deepens and the workhouse settles into restless sleep, the punishment cells remain occupied. Someone sits in darkness for refusing to work. Someone lies on a hard floor for stealing bread. Someone stands holding a sign for talking back to a matron. The system grinds on, maintaining order through fear, compliance through coercion, control through cruelty. Women's experiences in the workhouse differed significantly from men's, shaped by Victorian gender assumptions and the particular vulnerabilities women faced in poverty. The workhouse treated women as a separate category, with its own rules, work assignments, and moral judgments. Women entered the workhouse for various reasons, each carrying its own stigma. Widows who couldn't support themselves were considered deserving poor. They hadn't done anything wrong, just had bad luck. Single women who'd lost employment faced more judgment. Why couldn't they find work? Unmarried mothers were judged most harshly, their poverty seen as punishment for sexual sin. The classification system treated female sexuality as a central concern. Women were divided into categories: married women, widows, spinsters, pregnant women, mothers with young children, and the infamous women of bad character, prostitutes or women suspected of prostitution. Your classification determined not just your work, but your moral standing in the institution. Unmarried pregnant women faced special humiliation. Their condition was visible proof of moral failure. They were segregated from other women, given the hardest work, subjected to sermons about sin and redemption. When they gave birth, they were required to breastfeed their babies for at least a year, partly for the child's health, partly as punishment, forcing them to bond with the result of their sin. The lying-in ward was where women gave birth in the workhouse. It was typically a small room off the women's ward with a few beds and minimal equipment. Women in labor received little pain relief. Suffering in childbirth was considered a woman's lot, possibly divinely ordained punishment for Eve's sin. A midwife attended if available. If not, another inmate with experience served. Birth in the workhouse was lonely and frightening. No family present, no familiar midwife, no comfortable home. Just a hard bed in an institutional room with other women laboring and birthing, all of you strangers brought together by poverty and bad fortune. The babies born in these rooms started life at the very bottom of society's hierarchy. Infant mortality for workhouse babies was horrifying, sometimes over 50% in the first year. Mothers couldn't produce adequate breast milk on workhouse rations. Babies caught every illness circulating in the crowded building. Those who survived infancy often died in childhood from malnutrition, disease, or the general conditions of workhouse life. Mothers with young children faced heartbreaking choices. Keep your child with you in the workhouse, where they'd likely sicken and die, or let them be sent elsewhere, to relatives if any existed, to foster care, to other institutions. Either choice meant suffering. Keep them, and watch them deteriorate, send them away, and wonder if you'd ever see them again. This separation policy tore families apart. You might live in the same building as your children, but rarely see them. Boys over 7 went to the boys' ward. Older girls went to the women's ward to learn domestic work. Young children went to the nursery. You caught glimpses through windows, brief visits on Sunday if allowed, but couldn't comfort them when they cried or protect them from harsh treatment. This separation was intentional policy, designed to discourage women from having children they couldn't support. The theory was that having children in the workhouse was sufficiently miserable, women would avoid pregnancy. The reality was just widespread suffering among mothers forced to watch their children grow up as strangers. Women's work assignments reflected Victorian assumptions about gender. Women did domestic work, cooking, cleaning, laundry, sewing. They picked oakum. They minded children in the nursery. They prepared food in the kitchen. They did the washing up after meals. They scrubbed floors, cleaned privies, mended clothes. The laundry was particularly brutal. Huge tubs of boiling water, heavy wet sheets, lye soap that burned skin, steam that made the air hard to breathe, hours of scrubbing and wringing and hanging. In summer, the heat was unbearable. In winter, you stepped from steam into freezing air to hang washing outside.
Nursing was another female occupation. Pauper nurses cared for sick inmates in the infirmary with no training and minimal supplies. They bathed patients, changed bedding, administered medicines, sat with the dying. This work was emotionally draining and physically exhausting, and carried the risk of catching whatever diseases the patients had. Women's quarters were similarly gendered. The women's ward had rows of beds, each with its tiny space for possessions. Day rooms where women could sit during leisure hours had hard benches and cold walls. The women's yard for outdoor exercise was separate from the men's, preventing any possibility of inappropriate interaction. The rules for women were strict and numerous. No talking after lights out. No leaving the ward without permission. No possession of anything not approved. No writing letters without the master's knowledge. No visitors except on designated days and under strict supervision. No contact with men except during communal activities like chapel or meals. Older women had their own struggles. Elderly widows who'd lost husbands and couldn't work ended up in the workhouse for their final years. They did light work if capable, mending, watching children, light cleaning. If too infirm to work, they sat in the day room or lay in the infirmary, waiting to die. These elderly women often had the saddest stories. Women who'd worked hard all their lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, now ending their days in an institution dependent on parish charity, their dignity stripped away. They remembered better times, told stories about their lives before poverty, maintained what pride they could in circumstances designed to be humiliating. Women with disabilities faced particular challenges. The workhouse classified people by ability to work. A woman who couldn't work full-time might be classified as able-bodied anyway, and forced to try, leading to injury or illness. Or she might be classified as infirm, and sent to the infirmary, losing what little agency the able-bodied retained. Mental illness in women was treated with less patience than in men. A woman who became depressed, anxious, or exhibited what would now be recognized as PTSD from trauma was labeled hysterical or unstable. She might be restrained, isolated, transferred to the asylum if symptoms continued. The workhouse had no concept of mental health care, just punishment for behavior that disrupted routine. Sexual harassment and assault by male staff or male inmates was a constant danger. Women had no protection if a master, guard, or other male authority figure chose to abuse them. Complaints went nowhere. Who would believe a pauper woman over a respectable man? Pregnancy resulting from assault was treated as the woman's fault, proof of her moral character. The fact that many had been coerced, assaulted, or deceived by men who promised marriage didn't matter. The blame fell entirely on the woman. The workhouse tried to reform women's morals along with providing for their physical needs. Sermons emphasized female virtue, chastity, obedience. Women were taught their proper place, subservient to male authority, focused on domestic duties, grateful for charity, understanding that their poverty reflected moral as well as material failure. Some women internalized these messages, believing they deserved their circumstances, that they'd somehow failed at being women. Others resented the moral lessons while being powerless to reject them. Still others maintained their self-worth despite constant messaging that they were less valuable than men and less deserving of respect or comfort. Women who'd worked as servants before entering the workhouse sometimes found employment again after leaving. The workhouse trained women in domestic work, and households always needed servants. But workhouse taint made finding positions difficult. Many employers wouldn't hire anyone associated with the poor law. Prostitution was sometimes an alternative to the workhouse, sometimes what led women to the workhouse. Women might turn to sex work when they couldn't find other employment, then end up in the workhouse when they were too sick or old to continue. Or they might leave the workhouse for prostitution, preferring the dangers of street life to institutional misery. The workhouse's treatment of prostitutes was particularly harsh. Women suspected of prostitution were segregated, given the hardest work, subjected to additional moral instruction. The goal was to shame them into reformation. By the early 20th century, the Victorian workhouse system was clearly failing. The harsh deterrent philosophy had been discredited, public opinion had shifted, and new social welfare approaches were emerging. But the workhouses themselves lasted well into the 20th century, long after the ideology that created them had been abandoned.
The Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 dramatically reduced the number of elderly in workhouses. For the first time, people over 70 could receive money, 5 shillings per week, directly from the government, no workhouse required. Thousands of elderly people who'd expected to die in the workhouse were able to maintain independent lives instead. The National Insurance Act of 1911 provided health insurance and unemployment benefits for workers. This created a safety net that caught people before they fell into complete destitution. Workhouse admissions dropped as people had alternatives. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, changed everything. Labor shortages meant jobs for everyone. Wages rose. The workhouses emptied as able-bodied inmates left for war work or military service. The institutions filled instead with elderly, chronically ill, mentally disabled, people who couldn't work rather than people who wouldn't. After the war, attitudes continued shifting. The generation that returned from the trenches had no patience for Victorian moralizing about deserving and undeserving poor. They'd seen horrors that made workhouse fears seem quaint. The old certainties about class and poverty had been shaken by war. The Local Government Act of 1929 abolished the Poor Law Guardians and Boards of Guardians. Responsibility for poor relief transferred to county and borough councils. The workhouses officially became public assistance institutions, a name change that reflected shifting philosophy even though the buildings and many practices remained the same. The 1930s depression filled the institutions again. Unemployment meant even willing workers couldn't find jobs. The old workhouse buildings, now under new management and new names, housed thousands of unemployed workers and their families. The stigma remained, but weakened. It was harder to blame moral failure when entire industries shut down. The Second World War accelerated changes.
Some workhouse buildings were repurposed as emergency hospitals, military facilities, evacuation centers. The mixture of uses broke down the association between buildings and purpose. A place that had housed paupers now housed wounded soldiers, heroes, not failures. The welfare state emerged from World War II. The Beveridge Report of 1942 proposed comprehensive social insurance from cradle to grave. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, provided free health care for everyone. The National Assistance Act of 1948 finally, formally abolished the Poor Law that had governed welfare since 1834. The old workhouse buildings received new purposes. Some became hospitals. The infirmary sections expanded. The residential sections converted to wards. The architecture adapted to medical use. Many former workhouses still operate as hospitals today, though few people know these modern facilities' grim origins. Others became elderly care homes, mental hospitals, homeless shelters, continuing to serve vulnerable populations but under different philosophies and with different standards. The buildings outlasted the ideology that created them, adapted to new purposes while retaining traces of old shame. Some were demolished. Communities wanted to erase the physical reminders of harsh past. The workhouse buildings were architecturally undistinguished, utilitarian structures with no beauty to justify preservation. They came down without much mourning, replaced by housing estates or commercial developments. A few were preserved as museums or historic sites. These preserved workhouses allow modern visitors to see where ancestors might have lived, to understand Victorian poverty firsthand. Walking through these preserved buildings is sobering. The narrow beds, the cramped rooms, the institutional architecture speaks volumes about how Victorian society viewed the poor. The legacy of the workhouse system extends beyond buildings. The stigma of being on the dole or receiving welfare has roots in workhouse attitudes about deserving versus undeserving poor. The suspicion that welfare recipients are lazy or fraudulent echoes Victorian beliefs about moral failure and poverty. Modern welfare systems struggle with the same tension the Victorians faced. How to help people in need while encouraging self-sufficiency. How to provide adequate support without creating dependency. These questions remain unresolved, though we approach them with less moral judgment than the Victorians did. The family separations of the workhouse system left lasting trauma. Children who grew up in workhouses, separated from parents and siblings, carried those wounds throughout their lives. Some searched for decades to find lost family members. Some never reconnected, the workhouse separation permanent, despite both parties surviving and wanting reunion. The psychological impact on people who experienced the workhouse was profound and lasting. Many who passed through workhouses never spoke of it, the shame too great. They took the secret to their graves, their children and grandchildren never knowing their ancestors' suffering. The silence itself became part of the legacy. The workhouse system shaped modern British identity in subtle ways. The National Health Service was created partly in reaction to workhouse medical care, a determination that sick people would never again be treated as paupers, that healthcare was a right, not charity. The welfare state emerged from rejection of Victorian approaches to poverty. Records from workhouses provide invaluable historical data. The meticulous record-keeping, registers of admission and discharge, birth and death records, punishment books, dietary records, allow historians and genealogists to track individuals and families. But these dry records can't capture the human experience, the suffering and resilience of people reduced to statistics in ledgers. Personal testimonies from people who experienced workhouses are rare but precious. A few memoirs and interviews survive, giving voice to people history tried to silence. These accounts consistently describe the workhouse as traumatic: separation from family, inadequate food, harsh treatment, and loss of dignity and autonomy.
The workhouse children who were boarded out or adopted often fared better than those who stayed institutionalized. But they carried their own trauma, being sent away from families, sometimes never seeing parents or siblings again.
The lucky ones were placed with kind foster families who treated them well. Others experienced exploitation or abuse in foster homes with no oversight. The elderly who spent their final years in workhouses died knowing they'd failed society's test. They hadn't saved enough, hadn't kept family connections strong enough, hadn't maintained independence long enough. The workhouse reinforced the message that they were failures, and many internalized that message even while recognizing the system's injustice. Women who'd given birth in workhouses carried shame about their children's origins. Illegitimacy remained stigmatized well into the 20th century. Being born in the workhouse marked people, affecting marriage prospects and employment opportunities, even generations later. The workhouse masters and staff who'd administered the system mostly disappeared into obscurity. Unlike the inmates, their stories weren't preserved. They were just doing jobs, administering a system they didn't create. Some surely felt guilty about their roles. Others saw themselves as performing necessary work. Most probably didn't think much about it, just another job to earn a living. The guardians who'd overseen workhouses and made policy decisions were often prominent local citizens, businessmen, landowners, professionals. Their involvement in poor law administration was noted in obituaries but not dwelt upon. By the mid-20th century, having been a workhouse guardian was slightly embarrassing rather than the civic duty it had been considered in Victorian times. The reformers, who fought to improve workhouse conditions or abolish the system entirely, deserve remembering. People like Louisa Twining, Dr. Joseph Rogers, Agnes Elizabeth Jones, Florence Nightingale. They used their privilege and position to advocate for those with no voice. Their work saved lives and eventually transformed the system. But change came so slowly. The workhouse system lasted over a century. Millions of people passed through its doors. Hundreds of thousands died within its walls. The human cost was enormous, paid by people who had no choice, who were poor through bad luck or economic circumstances, or the simple fact of being born into poverty. The Victorian workhouse represents a cautionary tale about how societies treat vulnerable people. When efficiency and economy matter more than dignity and compassion, when poverty is treated as moral failure, when institutions prioritize deterrence over care, the result is systemic cruelty that harms individuals and society. Modern welfare states aren't perfect. They struggle with similar tensions, make similar mistakes, sometimes fall into similar patterns of punishing poverty rather than addressing it. But we've learned from Victorian failures. We've rejected the harshest aspects of their approach. We've recognized that how we treat the most vulnerable reflects our society's character. The workhouse buildings that remain stand as monuments to that harsh past. They remind us what happens when society prioritizes economy over humanity, when fear of dependency outweighs compassion for suffering, when institutions designed to help instead inflict harm. As this long journey through the Victorian workhouse ends, you lie in your comfortable bed with adequate food, healthcare, and social safety nets unimaginable to Victorian paupers. You have freedoms they couldn't dream of: freedom from hunger, freedom from institutional control, freedom to make choices about your own life. But millions of people worldwide still live in conditions not much better than Victorian workhouses: poverty, institutional control, inadequate food and medical care, family separation. These aren't just historical problems. They persist in different forms, in different places, affecting different people. The ghosts of the workhouse haunt us still, reminding us that how we treat the vulnerable matters, that dignity matters, that every person deserves basic decency regardless of their economic circumstances, that institutional efficiency should never override human. The workhouse's treatment of prostitutes was particularly harsh. Women suspected of prostitution were segregated, given the hardest work, subjected to additional moral instruction. The goal was to shame them into reformation. The reality was that many returned to sex work after leaving because no other options existed for women labeled as fallen.
The clothing women wore in the workhouse marked their status visibly. The rough cotton dresses, the shapeless aprons, the caps that hid hair, all designed to strip away individuality and femininity. Looking in a mirror, if mirrors were available, which they often weren't, women saw themselves transformed into generic paupers, their identities erased by institutional uniformity. Some women maintained their appearance as best they could within restrictions. They braided their hair neatly, kept their caps clean, mended their dresses carefully. These small acts of self-care were resistance, ways of asserting that they still cared about themselves, despite being in a place that treated them as worthless. Letters from the outside world were treasured by women inmates. A letter from a sister, a daughter, a friend, proof that someone outside remembered you existed, cared about you, thought you worth writing to. These letters were read until they fell apart, every word memorized, a connection to the life you'd lost and might someday regain. Visits were regulated and supervised. Family members who visited had to meet in a designated room under a matron's watchful eye. No physical contact, no passing of items without inspection, conversations monitored for inappropriate content. The visit itself was a reminder of separation and loss, seeing loved ones but unable to properly embrace or speak freely. Women who'd been middle class before falling into poverty found the workhouse especially traumatic. They'd been raised with expectations of maintaining households, managing servants, participating in genteel society. Now they were performing the labor they'd once supervised, living in conditions they'd never imagined experiencing, stripped of every marker of their former status.
These respectable women tried to maintain distance from those they considered truly poor, the women who'd never had anything, who'd grown up in poverty, who fit the pauper stereotype. But the workhouse made everyone equal in misery. The middle-class widow scrubbed the same floors, ate the same gruel, slept in the same crowded ward as the woman who'd been destitute all her life. Elderly women sometimes became informal grandmothers to younger inmates, offering advice and comfort, sharing wisdom from long lives. These relationships created pseudo-families within the workhouse, surrogate kinship networks that replaced the real families separation had destroyed. The death of women in the workhouse often went unmourned except by these informal families. No elaborate funerals, no weeping crowds, just a simple service and burial in the pauper section of the cemetery. Your workhouse friends might attend if allowed, but often women died alone, their passing noted in a register and forgotten. Women who left the workhouse after long stays faced difficult readjustment. The outside world had moved on without them. Families had changed, friends had drifted away, opportunities had passed. The skills they'd learned in the workhouse, oakum-picking, institutional laundry, weren't much use in regular employment, and the stigma of having been in the workhouse followed them. Some women cycled in and out of the workhouse repeatedly. They'd leave, find work that couldn't sustain them, lose employment during economic downturns, return to the workhouse. Each return felt like failure, confirming the message that they were inadequate, unable to manage independent life. Others escaped permanently, finding stable work or remarrying or somehow cobbling together existence outside the walls. These women rarely talked about their workhouse time, the shame too great to share. Their children might never know their mothers had been paupers, the secret buried as deeply as possible. The psychological impact of workhouse experience on women was profound and lasting. Many developed what we'd now recognize as depression, anxiety, PTSD. They lost trust in others, in systems, in the world's basic fairness. They learned that asking for help meant losing your autonomy, that dependency equaled degradation. Some women found strength in survival. Having endured the workhouse, they felt they could endure anything. They developed resilience, resourcefulness, determination not to ever return. These qualities served them well in the harsh economic landscape of Victorian England, where survival often required extraordinary toughness. Women's experiences in the workhouse were shaped by factors beyond their control. Gender, class, age, marital status, pregnancy, moral reputation. The intersection of these factors determined how they were treated, what work they did, how much sympathy they received, whether they were considered deserving or undeserving poor. The system's cruelty toward women reflected broader Victorian attitudes about female worth and women's place in society. A woman's value derived from relationships, as daughter, wife, or mother. Women who lacked these relationships or whose relationships failed to provide financial security were seen as somehow deficient, having failed at women's primary purpose. Yet, women maintained their humanity despite systematic efforts to strip it away. They loved their children even when separated from them. They formed friendships even when those friendships might be torn apart by transfers or deaths. They maintained hope even when hope seemed irrational. They survived. As night settles over the women's ward, you hear the particular sounds of female suffering: quiet crying, prayers whispered, the rustle of someone checking on a sick wardmate, the creak of a bed as a pregnant woman tries to find comfortable position on a thin mattress. These sounds tell stories of endurance, of the specific ways poverty and institutional life impacted women's bodies and spirits. Tomorrow, they'll wake to the same bell, the same gruel, the same work, the same rules. But tonight, in the hours between waking and sleeping, some women dream of better days, days when they had homes and families, when they were more than pauper number 47 in the women's ward, when their lives held possibility rather than just endless routine punctuated by suffering. And so we come to the end of our night's journey through the Victorian workhouse. You've walked the cold corridors, eaten the thin gruel, picked the endless oakum, felt the weight of institutional life pressing down on every moment. You've met the children separated from their mothers, the elderly dying far from home, the families torn apart by a system that claimed to help them. It's heavy, this history. The suffering was real. The cruelty was systematic. The lives lived within those walls mattered, even though the system treated them as barely mattering at all. But you've also witnessed resilience, people who maintained their humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, mothers who loved their children despite separation, friends who supported each other through shared misery, individuals who escaped or endured or simply survived another day. Human dignity persisting despite everything designed to strip it away. These stories deserve telling, deserve remembering. The people who suffered in workhouses weren't just statistics in ledgers or names in registers. They were individuals with hopes and fears, with memories of better times and dreams of futures that might never come. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, workers and neighbors, people like you and me who had had the misfortune of being born into the wrong century, the wrong economic circumstances.
Now it's time to let these stories rest. You've visited the past, walked through its shadows, felt its cold stones under your feet. You've done the work of remembering, of bearing witness, of acknowledging suffering that history too often forgets. The workhouse is quiet now. The bells have stopped ringing. The inmates have finally been allowed to sleep without the promise of another harsh dawn. The masters and matrons have set down their keys. The guardians have closed their ledgers. The buildings themselves have mostly crumbled or been transformed into something gentler. Let the images fade now. The narrow beds blur into softness. The thin gruel dissolves into mist. The oakum shed grows distant and indistinct. The walls that imprisoned so many become transparent, then disappear entirely, leaving only stars and gentle darkness. You're no longer in the workhouse. You're in your own bed, in your own time, safe and warm and free. The scratchy blanket becomes soft cotton. The hard mattress becomes comfortable support. The cold air becomes the perfect temperature. The sounds of suffering fade into the quiet hum of modern life. A heater, distant traffic, the ordinary sounds of a world that's moved beyond Victorian cruelty.
Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Release the tension you've been carrying through these stories. The history is important. The remembering matters. But you don't have to hold on to it tightly. Let it settle gently into memory, there when you need it, but not weighing on you as you sleep. Your hands don't hurt from oakum. Your stomach is full. Your family is near. You have choices about tomorrow, autonomy over your own life, dignity that no institution can strip away. These are gifts beyond measure, luxuries that Victorian paupers couldn't imagine. As you drift towards sleep, let gratitude mix with the sadness. Grateful for the distance between their time and yours. Grateful for the reformers who fought to change things. Grateful for the slow, imperfect progress that brought us from there to here. Grateful simply to be alive now rather than then, to have what they lacked: comfort, security, freedom. The workhouse is finally empty. The last inmate has left. The doors stand open. Light streams through windows once barred and small. The buildings that held so much suffering now hold only air and memory, and the quiet acknowledgement that this chapter of history has closed. Sleep now. Let the weight of the past settle like dust. Let the stories you've heard become part of the larger story you carry, the understanding of how far we've come and how much farther we need to go. Let compassion for those long-dead paupers translate into compassion for people suffering now, wherever they are, whatever form their poverty takes. Tomorrow you'll wake in a world with problems still unsolved, with poverty and suffering that persist in new forms. But tonight, just sleep. Rest in the comfort they never had. Dream peacefully as they rarely could. Take the ease they were denied, not with guilt, but with quiet thankfulness and a promise to remember, to care, to do better than those who came before. The workhouse bells are silent. The gruel pots are empty. The oakum has all been picked. The ledgers are closed. And somewhere in the dark, the spirits of those who suffered there are finally at rest. Sleep well. The night is kind. Morning will come gently, and you are safe, warm, free, and far from the Victorian workhouse's cold embrace. Good night.